Okay, so I'm going to introduce you to Azure Digital Twins, and let's start by looking at the first part of this, which is the LoRaWAN devices and gateway. So LoRaWAN, which is this low power wide area networking protocol, as I said, it is designed for battery operated devices. So it doesn't drain in terms of energy usage. What does it give you? It gives you bidirectional communication. So you can upload data. You can also download data to the device. There's end-to-end security on this. So it can't, well, essentially, there's enough security to ensure that it's difficult to hack. And of course, there are mobility and localization services associated with that. The local network device that all of this information from the sensors goes to is known as the gateway. In this case, I've got a UG56, which is out of view, but that's connected. I am using the Microsoft Azure platform. And as I said, there's an IoT hub that brings together all the information into Azure. Then there's this event grid. The Azure Function app processes that data in readiness for going to the digital twin. You've got the Scene Studio, which allows you to see that data in a 3D spatial context. You've got the twin graph, which then establishes the relationships between the objects that the data represents. The event hub then processes that data and pushes it through into the Data Explorer, which is essentially a database. And Power BI can then be used to process that data. So those are the key components that we're going to be looking at. I've got a jargon buster that I've actually posted into the chat for this particular presentation. So please have a look at the jargon buster. I'm not going to go through in detail here, but this will help you to understand the terminology that I'm using. It's put in plain English. The idea is not to be scholarly about it, but simply to give you the opportunity to make more sense of some of the terms that are being used. So here's where the story of this journey begins. And it begins actually with my unsustainable present. I always had an inkling that there were some issues with the amount of gas consumption that we were using. There's overheating in certain rooms. And I know that that isn't something you'd expect to be normal in a house. And there are things that you can do about that. I appreciate, there's common sense things you can do about that. I don't think the gas consumption issue really has anything to do with cooking. I think a lot of it has to do with the heating in the house. And early December, I got my gas bill. And as you can see here, I'm not going to hide this. This is telling me that I'm using significantly more gas than the similar period last year. Year on year, I'm using more gas. And these are all the different radiators in the house. You'll see that there's no radiator in the downstairs bathroom, and that's reflecting the temperatures in that room. We don't call it the icebox for nothing. Anyway, moving on swiftly. This is the difference in energy consumption and costs. I'm not trying to say these are just real world values that we've got here. There's been a 10% increase. It's not reflected in a 10% increase in energy costs, but that doesn't matter. I think it's important from a sustainability perspective to understand why that's happening. And as you see there, to go from 18,800 kilowatt hours to 20,680 is a significant jump in 1 year. This is the setup of different tools. I'm not going into different detail, but it's quite a stage-by-stage process in streaming Internet of Things data from what I call my UP, which is unsustainable present. There are some things I'm going to call out about that data which help us to see what's going on and why my energy bills are so high. There's also some of this stuff here we're going to be covering over the next 7 sessions. I'm going to do 1 a month because I think it gives people sufficient time to absorb. And I credit the Centre for Digital Built Britain with this particular image, but it's really important because in the case of my home twin, as much as any other digital twin, there are three things that we need to do. We need data, we need analysis, but importantly, we also need interventions. We need to do something with that analysis. We need to. So what data did I generate? Well, this is the data that was generated from the sensors in the different rooms. To just be clear, in this room, which is bedroom 2, there is a sensor essentially on the radiator. So it's a thermostat, but it's also a sensor the room temperature alongside being able to set a target temperature for that particular radiator. And I've done so in 3 other rooms and then in 2 other rooms. And you can see the temperatures, 30 degrees in winter. I know it's cold, but those are temperatures. I spent 18 years of my life in Barbados, and yes, 30-degree temperatures over there are quite normal, but very often it's lower than that. So why am I getting those high temperatures? This is where I'd like to say you start with common sense. I think very often when it comes to analysis, with jumping, we're almost chomping at the bit to crunch some numbers and to be data driven. Well, we should probably be driven by common sense first. And there is a device that we use essentially to set the heating profile for the entire week, and it just repeats itself. You can change it for holiday mode and that type of thing. This particular sensor that we use has been set up not by me. Without any further explanation, well, when I looked at the manual for this particular sensor, this is the heating profile that is by default. 21 degrees Celsius at 6:30, 8 a.m. 18 degrees, 21 degrees at noon, 18 degrees at 2 p.m., 21 degrees at 6 p.m., and then at 10:30, 16 degrees. So you can see it's quite it's a fluctuation, but we're talking max about 5 degrees. Yeah, that's maximum fluctuation. This is what I found with the settings that we had on our device. 27 degrees at 5:30, 17 degrees at 8 a.m., 4:30, 20 degrees. I think I made some mistakes with the times there. 26.5 degrees at 4:30 actually. At 8 p.m., 31.5 degrees, and then at 9 p.m., 17 degrees. Suddenly, the graph makes sense. Now, I know what some people say, well, you've probably invested quite a bit to get to the stage of finding out that, yes, your heating profile was wrong. Yeah, that's a valid point to make. But of course, the reason why I'm doing this is because I want to show that we can focus on outcomes. And the outcome that I'm trying to focus on, of course, is reducing my gas consumption. And this just happens to be a case in point. But there are other types of outcomes that people might be trying to address with a digital twin. What's also disturbing are the large variations in temperature. Some of you would know, if you've worked with gas central heating, you know that it probably means that we need to bleed and balance the radiators. So apart from updating the heating profile, I probably need to look at bleeding and balancing the radiators. It doesn't mean that nobody knew that before. It doesn't mean that, oh, the data showed me something that I didn't know before. But it does show me that the data aligns with experience. And this is probably the challenge, isn't it? Because the challenge we have is the cost of analyzing the data from my unsustainable presence. There are platform costs, which you can see there. Monthly platform costs are not that high. These are standard costs of using the Azure platform. The development tools, well, there's been some developer support, and there's also been a 5 gig that I paid for. Probably the most significant cost is the cost of these devices themselves, because I'm placing these old school radiator controls with these updated sensors and actuators and so on. And so you then have to think, well, how do I, if I was doing this in a business context, how could I justify that cost? To simply tell me, oh, you need to adjust the heating profile, and you also need to think about the um, the temperatures variation by bleeding. But if you look at the broader picture, then you start to think that there are other opportunities that we should be considering, and that we probably then would take a very different view if we start to think about them in this context. So let's have a look at a few of the examples that we have here. So, for instance, in the case of the, say, particulate matter, this is an indoor air quality sensor, and it gives me the particulate matter values. Well, obviously, if I was working in a laboratory or heritage situation, that would matter, because if it's going to affect lab preparations or it's going to affect heritage assets, then it becomes a significant problem. And being able to capture that across all of the different spaces within the asset that I'm looking after is probably an important thing. And the good thing about it is that the same protocol that I've used for these temperature sensors, it's the same protocol that's being used in these for these types of devices as well. Smoke detection. I mean, you could think in terms of this alert from the smoke detector going into the Azure platform, but then sending a drawing or even 3D model to a platform that the fire service is able to open and identify the exact location of that particular fire. Vibration obviously is an important one. Vibration tells you about machine failure. It could predict imminent failure. So having one of these Advantech vibration sensors is a useful thing in that context. Again, if you are in an estate management situation and you've got piling going on in construction, then having this vibration monitor and showing you and keeping you an alert when the values are high enough to cause settlement would be a useful thing. Another one would be intruder detection. And now some people will say, well, hold on a sec, you've got intruder detection that works across all different systems. There are lots of proprietary ones. The power of this platform is that it consolidates the information across a wide number of assets, a complete portfolio, instead of being dependent on very much locked in proprietary solutions, which are very often black box solutions as well. And then you could think about an AI people counter, which doesn't actually violate GDPR because it doesn't capture personally identifiable information. But think about things like shopping malls, being able to predict footfall. You could look at queue management. You could look at emergency egress from public arenas and facilities. You could look at sports and entertainment venues as well. All of those things would be examples. So that's worthwhile data. I know some people say, well, temperature and humidity could be actually still worthwhile data, especially if you're in sensitive situations. But we need to think outside of those simple terms. This brings me to outcome engineering. It was a mainstay of my previous work with Autodesk. And one way of defining an outcome is it's a measurable change that demonstrates performance improvement. McKinsey report identified a series of levers. And in our case, in terms of energy consumption, we'd be looking at things like smart energy consumption, intelligent IoT devices, and real-time yield optimization as some of the examples of. So what this starts to say to me is that I need to propose some outcomes that we're going to be looking at over an extended period of time. And in this case, what I would be looking at is a greater than 10% reduction in year-on-year gas energy consumption. So I want to bring this back down to where it should be. I don't want to reduce my current level of thermal comfort, and I certainly don't want to reduce the non-heating energy usage. So things like cooking, I don't want to reduce those at all. And I'm looking for a 3-year payback on the initial investment. So what it would look like is I want to recoup 50% of the hardware costs, 50% of the development costs, and 100% of the running costs, which is 42 quid a month. So what we're talking about is 449 quid over 3 years. We're talking about 149.67 year-on-year savings, and that is going to be adjusted for inflation. So this is a target that I'm going to be going after over the next 3 years. But you can sort of see now what the value of a digital twin is, because this helps me to assess whether I'm tracking progress, because I will also be tracking my energy consumption at the same time. It shows me whether bleeding or balancing the radiators has made a difference. It shows me whether those sensors that I have put in each room are making a difference. It shows me whether the heating profile that I've set up for the central heating is making a difference. In terms of visualizing the digital twin, we were going to be talking about this. This is an example. You can see how the information is being updated, and that you can select, for instance, this is the room that I'm actually in, which is bedroom 2. You can see that at the back of the house. Essentially, it's given me, again, a high temperature, 24.6. What I've tried to do is change the heating profile to reduce that. It's coming down to 21 degrees. And you can see the humidity value there as well. So I want to go through to finish the 5 lessons that I've learned. And I think it's quite important to look at that across these. Probably the first one, and it comes from the expenditure on this, but this has been a learning experience for me. So this is very different from saying that I was implementing a digital twin in order to find out that my heating profile has changed or that I had to bleed the radiators. And my first point then is, don't use a sledgehammer to crack a walnut, right? If common sense can give you an indication of the right thing to do, follow their common sense. I think that sometimes when people are talking about data-driven, they have to be careful that they're not looking for an excuse against making a decision. Make a decision, use your common sense, but if data helps, then obviously use as much of it as you can to support that decision. The second thing is people have different horizons of value. There are people who have a horizon of value which is very short range and very tactical and very reactive. It's simply the circumstances to deal with. They may be in a constrained project situation where they can't think about long-term strategic goals. And my point is, there's no sense trying to persuade somebody in that position that the long view is the right one when they have to make tactical decisions, which very often are just expedient under the circumstances they find themselves in. Be aware of that. The third lesson is probably that if you're a detail person, look for big picture people to complement your focus. And vice versa. If you are a big picture person who is about the broad vision, doesn't want to get into the weeds, find a detailed person. The perfect combination of that was probably Steve Jobs, big picture, big vision, and Steve Wozniak, the detail guy, perfect combination. Look for somebody who complements your vision and your mindset. This fourth one is a saying from Albert Einstein, which is the only real valuable thing is intuition. So it's worth remembering that. How much does intuition and common sense inform your judgment? Sometimes data is there to either dispel those assumptions, but it doesn't mean that data is there to displace your own use of intuition. And then finally, I would say do rely on hard-won expertise of people in the field, subject matter experts who actually are experts in the field that you're working in. Because very often their interpretation of the data that you give them is going to be better than somebody who isn't informed and is simply using the data without any context of the industry that they are applying it to. So I think it's really important that that lesson is learned. Look, it's been a great time. Time to take off the Christmas hat. Time to take off the Santana guitar. And to basically wish you a Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year, and to invite you to the 7 Home Twins 2025 sessions that we're going to be running next year. So once again, thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you